As you can see, I was doing a little bit of gardening there. Springtime. It's a wonderful time of year. Everything's beginning to green up. Days are getting longer, and it's that time of year. Renewal, rebirth. It's just up there planting some cold weather root vegetables in the raised bed. I'm gonna go tomorrow and get some materials and plan on building 3 more raised beds, a little bit bigger than that one. But in today's video, I was going to talk about some forgotten Appalachian traditions, I guess you could say. But first I wanted to tell you a little story about something that I seen the other day. Something wholesome. Something wonderful. So let me take a seat here and tell you more about it. I've mentioned before that I drive a truck for a living. And a few weeks ago, I was in Chattooga County, Georgia, which is a county in near the northwest corner of Georgia. And I was driving through a very rural part of that county. Lots of farmland. There was mountains, pretty valleys. The mountains aren't anywhere near as high in elevation as they are back where I'm from, but they are mountains nonetheless. Really pretty farmland. It's a 2-lane country road. It isn't even painted. The road is traveled so infrequently. And I noticed that there was a really pretty house. It was an older house, possibly built, I don't know, maybe in the 30s or 40s, a 2-story house. It would kind of remind you of a old plantation house. They had a really big front porch, a really picturesque house there. And across the road from their house and their yard, this is an area that's pretty heavily forested, but they had an area cleared out, I don't know, probably about an acre or so. And they had a pretty stone wall built alongside, probably about 5 yards from the edge of the other road. A really pretty stone wall that had a gate that you walked into, and then you walked into their gardens. I could see that they had, raspberry bushes, blackberry bushes, plots for other vegetables too. A really pretty little piece of land. Well, then a few days ago, I was driving through there in the morning, as I end up doing some mornings on the job. And as I was driving by, I seen a grandmother, a lady in her, if I had to guess, she was in her late 60s, maybe her early 70s, white-haired, had glasses. She was carrying a basket, and next to her was a little girl, cute little blonde girl, probably about 4 or 5 years old. They looked like they were having a good time. And as I drove by, they waved, and I waved back. That was a picture of something that is truly wholesome in my eyes. You see, a while back, I made this video here. And in that video I talked about I showed you in that video my great-grandfather's farm. My great-aunt, she still lives there to this day. Their land is at the top of a holler back home. And I can remember being a young boy. I was really close to my great-grandfather. He passed away when I was 9 years old back in 1996. But I was really close to him as a child. My grandfather lived at his place just a little ways up the road. my great-grandfather and great-aunt, his daughter, they lived there at the house. And I can remember, see, he would have been in his early 70s when I was born. But I can remember when I was 4 and 5 years old, walking around the fence line of his field and watching the neighbors, his neighbor from down the road who raised cattle, who was, I would guess, 30 years his junior. By then, my great-grandfather, he was up in his years, and he didn't raise as much livestock or anything as he once did. But his neighbor and his sons would come up there, and they would cut the hay, bale the hay in the field. And I can remember being with my great-grandfather, him holding my hand, and us walking around the fence line. You know, there's some very fond memories I have. But going back to this little girl and her grandmother, that little girl, that 4 or 5 year old little girl, she will remember this wherever she goes the rest of her life. Working in the garden with her grandmother. And what I hope happens is that when this young girl gets older, and she will find her a man, a good man that will take care of her, and they will have children. And then the cycle repeats. Her children grow up, they find them a good and suitable mate, and they have children. And perhaps many decades down the road, by this time I'm sure I will be dead and buried in the ground, cremated or whatever. But what I hope is that this 4 or 5 year old girl, when she is well on up in her years, will do the same very thing with her grandchildren. The never-ending cycle, you could say. This is what I hope for. And you know, there are powers and forces in this world who hates every single aspect of this beautiful and wholesome picture. They hate every single aspect of it. Not only do they want our people mixed out of existence by and large to become a minority, it's not only that, but they also want to erase any semblance of how we naturally live. You know, here in the future, they want us all huddled into these smart cities. Rural living, unfortunately, is a thing of the past, it seems, according to their plans. These powers and forces, unfortunately, they rule over us. And through manipulation, through coercion, through vilification of our people in rural living, they are trying to completely erase this. It's just up to us to resist this. But of course, yuns already know all these things. But this is something that is worth fighting for and worth saving. But what I was going to do, I was going to read out of this book here. It's called Witches, Ghosts, and Signs. I ordered it a little while back. It's written by a guy named Patrick W. Gaynor. He went all across West Virginia collecting and cataloging folk tales, ghost stories, and Appalachian folklore. He was a professor at the West Virginia University. And what I really like about this book, you see, I've noticed that a lot of books about Appalachian folklore, they tend to focus more on Cherokee folklore than they do the Europeans that settled this area. What I like about this book, though, is that it is written from an Anglo-Celtic and Germanic perspective, as he puts it. But what I was going to read to you is just a few of the traditions, the old traditions and customs that people had here in Appalachia. Birds really having a good time out there singing. You know, something that a lot of people think of whenever they think of Appalachia, they think of, the lonely mountaineer living in a cabin up on the ridge, miles and miles away from anyone else, which this is a rarer thing than people would imagine. People usually lived in, isolated communities. And I was reading these old traditions here, and, it's really, I've heard of a few of them, but some of them, they don't exist anymore. They haven't existed for a long time. I forget which company it is. I can't remember if it's a telephone company or some tech company. I remember them saying, in some of their commercials, technology bringing us closer together. Well, technology does do that to a degree. I mean, I'm making this video. It's untelling who's watching it or which part of the world that you might be in. So that's one thing that technology is good for, but technology has also driven us further apart. And some of these things that I'm going to read to you, it proves this to be true. Lately I've been thinking about what brings people in my area of the country together nowadays. And sadly, it's not very many things. Nowhere near as many as some of the things listed here in this book. Two of the things that I could think of right off the top of my head would be high school football or basketball games. And the other was church. But then I also got to thinking too, there are festivals nowadays, to this day. In my hometown, for instance, we have the Rhododendron Festival every June. In Erwin, Tennessee, in the fall, there is an apple festival. Erwin is a town that's about 45 minutes or so from where I was raised. And then the town that I was born in, over in North Carolina, just across the state line, every year they have the Woolly Worm Festival. So, there's festivals that draw people together, but by and large, it's not as close-knit as it used to be. And some of these things that I'm talking about, it plagues our people's communities all across the world. It's not just, isolated here in Appalachia. And then I also thought too, farmers markets. Farmers markets are a good way to get people together. And it seems like you see more of those nowadays, which is a good thing, I believe. But of course, our enemies have also noticed this. I've seen articles the last year or two saying that, farmers markets were, bastions of far-right activism and things like that, just absolute craziness, nonsense, Nowadays, basically, if you have any inclination of being, somewhat self-reliant, it doesn't matter if, you're a libertarian or a conservative or even a liberal, honestly. They are associating this, their vision, you wanting to rebel against their vision of the future for you, they're viewing it as, far-right activism. It's crazy, And our enemies, like I said, they have noticed it. Of course, like the articles that I've mentioned, I remember seeing that, I believe it was last year or the year before. But also, I was talking to one of my friends, Blackbird9. He has a really interesting podcast on his website, Blackbird Trading Posts. If I can remember, I'll put a link to it in the box below. But me and him were talking a couple of weeks ago, and he showed me something up there in Boone, North Carolina, which the town that I was born in is just up the mountain from Boone, North Carolina. And I was raised across the state line just over in Tennessee. But in Boone, North Carolina, they started something called queer farmers markets. You heard that right, queer farmers markets. You know, celebrate being a homo up in the holler. Get your fruit from these faggots. Queer farmers markets. So, you know, they just try to subvert anything, you know. It's these NGOs, I forget the name of the NGO right off the top of my head, that's promoting this bullshit. But it's happening. You know, the pause is really creeping in here, unfortunately. It's very tragic, very disgusting. But let me read a few of these old traditions to you right quickly. I'm not going to read all of them, but I'm going to read a few. Let me get here. The first one they talk about is the molasses boiling, or as how they call it in Appalachia, the molasses biling. One of the most enjoyable of the harvest time activities that combined work with social activity was the making of sorghum, called the molasses biling, which was held in the latter part of December. Almost every farmer planted a good-sized patch of cane in the late spring at corn planting time. It was planted in rows about 3 feet apart, which allowed room for working between the rows. In late September, the leaves were stripped from the green stalks before the stalks were cut. Some farmers cut the stalks before the leaves were stripped, leaving the job of stripping to the women and girls. See, everybody worked together. The children, the mothers, the fathers, the older people. It was a lot more tight-knit back then. It had to be. You know, I don't mean to... Let me interject here. It seems like, you know, how I mentioned earlier about, you know, the idea of the lone mountaineer living miles and miles and miles away from any other people, you know, that's a very rare thing, to be honest. Like I said, it was more or less people living in, you know, these isolated mountain communities, several families, just living in a holler, you know. Each holler was its own little sort of community. And I can attest to this just from the town that I'm from in northeast Tennessee. My dad has told me this, my grandparents told me this. There used to be a general store on every single holler. Every single one. When automobiles came to be more prevalent, like back in the 50s or so, the 60s, each little holler had its own little gas station and general store. The holler that I was raised on, at the bottom of it, where the creek joins the other creek, there is still an old white building there. And that used to be, you can see where the car could drive in under it. There was an overhanging roof, and there used to be gas pumps there. These little general stores. But over time, due to, you know, corporatization and things of that nature, all these little mountain stores eventually shut down over time. Each little holler was its own little community. And people were, you know, they were a lot more self-reliant, of course, back then. Men knew a lot more skills. Women knew a lot more skills. They raised their own things. But they would work together, as this tradition that I'm about to tell you indicates. They would work together, you know, to obtain things. And it seems like the powers that be, through technology and, you know, progress and all their bullshit, they've managed to trade our dependence on our nearest neighbors, our community. They've traded our dependence on our community to dependence on these, you know, huge international corporations and, you know, conglomerations. It's that's one of the reasons for this erosion and, you know, lack of community. It's just how I see it. They've traded it. They've traded us convenience for closeness with those around us. It's one of their one of their tricks, you could say. And they're going to keep doing that unless we just refuse. Refusal to comply. But anyway, I didn't mean to get too far off on that tangent there. One man went into the business of molasses making and purchased the equipment for the molasses boiling for as many as half a dozen communities. So he would go to, as many as 6 different haulers. One man, all the different farmers and families, they'd bring their sugar cane, and he would, work to process it into sorghum and molasses. It consisted of a mill with large rollers which pressed the juice from the stalks of cane, and an evaporating pan in which the juice was boiled down to a thick and sweet consistency called molasses or sorghum. The man who owned the equipment was an expert at making molasses, who knew when the juice had been boiled to the correct consistency to make good molasses. A schedule was arranged among farmers so that the molasses maker could take his equipment from place to place for all the farmers in the community. Sometimes a farmer who did not have a large crop of cane would cut his crop and haul it in a wagon to another farmer's boiling, so that several farmers might have molasses boiled at the same location. The mill which pressed the juice from the cane was turned by a single horse hitched to the end of a pole, which turned the rollers of the mill as the horse walked around the mill in a circle. The raw juice which flowed from the mill was poured into the evaporating pan, which was heated by a wood fire under it. From one end of the long pan, the juice was moved to the other end as it cooked. The master maker, who was in charge of the entire operation, with a long-handled wooden paddle, moved the juice slowly through the sluices in the pan until it was ready to be taken off through a spigot in the bottom of a pan. It was caught in the buckets and poured into stone jars and jugs. As the juice boiled and moved from one end of the pan to the other, a green scum arose to the top and was skimmed off and thrown in a hole which had been dug in the ground near the pan. This was called the skimming hole. Although the boiling went from morning till late at night, most of the people came at night, for that was when it became a molasses boiling party. An outside fire would be built to furnish light, and sometimes torches were made of rags soaked in crude oil would be placed around the site. Young and old alike would make small spoon wooden paddles, dip them in the molasses as it neared the finishing end of the pan, and lick the warm, tasty liquid from the paddles. Some of the young men always got together and made plans to trick someone into stepping into the skimming hole. They carefully camouflaged it to fool their unsuspecting victim, who was always some young man who was trying to impress the young ladies. When he finally stepped into the skimming hole up to his knees and got the green skimmings on his breeches, he became the object of much teasing and laughter. The young people played singing games, hide and seek, and other traditional games, while the older people tended to the molasses making and much pleasant conversation. Such was the molasses boiling, one of the finest examples of communal work combined with much fun. And in my lifetime, there's some of these traditions in here that I've heard of. The quilting bee, which is, where a group of women would get together and, work on sewing a quilt. I've seen churches back home, they've done this before, where the ladies of the church would get together and socialize and make a quilt. There's bean stringings and apple peelings. And what else is there? Excuse me. There was wheat threshing time, corn shucking, the singing school, the literary. I'll read to you what the literary was real quickly. By the beginning of this century, which this book was written by, I believe it was back in the 1970s. Let me look and see right quickly. Yes, this book was written back in 1975, actually. The literary, though, was by the beginning of this century, the country school had become a center for community activities. The event that brought many people to the school on one night each month was called the literary. It was a meeting of all the pupils of the school, their parents and friends, who came to participate in such activities as debates, dramatic skits, readings, recitations, and spelling contests. Sometimes a team of pupils would debate against a team of adults on some popular subject. Spelling contests were popular, with pupils and adults participating. Choral singing was also an important part of the literary. Let's see. Then it talks about Halloween and Christmas traditions. The last thing I would want to read to you real quickly, I don't want this video to be too terribly long, is wakes. And what a wake was this old funeral tradition. The word wake was originally like wake or lich wake from the Anglo-Saxon lich, a corpse, and wake, to watch, to keep vigil. It was an all-night watch of friends and relatives over the remains of the dead before the funeral. See, people didn't have funeral homes back then. The custom is of an unknown origin and antiquity. See, that's why I bought this book, was to learn more about, Appalachian traditions, at least from the European side. It seems like there's always, like I mentioned earlier, me and my friend Pat have talked about this. It seems like any folklore book you get about Appalachia focuses primarily on the Cherokee Indians, which of course they did have a role, of course, in this area. But they completely ignore the Europeans and a lot of their traditions, it seems. That's why I like this book so much. It's all about the Scots-Irish, the English, and the Germans who settled this area first. But where was I? And I was like I said, if you want to see an interesting video about an Appalachian tradition, I wrote a ticket last summer. Tickets is an Appalachian Germanic tradition. It's a pretty interesting video. It's one of the ones that I've probably enjoyed making the most since I've been doing this. And I believe it stretches back, to pre-Christian Germanic Europe. It's pretty interesting. Check it out when you're done with this if you wish. When a death occurred in the community, it was customary for friends to go immediately to the home to prepare the body for burial. At one time, even the casket was made by someone in the community who was skilled at this kind of work. The relatives of the deceased were relieved of all expenses if possible. Friends brought food to the home in preparation for the wake, which might be held for more than one night if time were needed for relatives to arrive for the funeral. A choir was assembled for the singing of the old hymns that were appropriate for the occasion, and prayers were said. People often came for many miles to attend the wake. It was a solemn occasion, not a party. Alcoholic beverages were not served. It was a time when relatives of the deceased returned to the home place and long-separated friends were reunited. The old world custom of tolling the bell when someone died was not usually observed in this part of the country. However, the bell of the church was always tolled as the funeral procession approached the church. This custom is almost never observed today, unfortunately. See, a lot of these traditions are dying out. How do we combat this, though, to finish this video out? I think the biggest way to combat it is to try to research, try to get land of your own, and, visit your family, visit your neighbors, Try to talk to each other. It seems like due to technology, that huge corporation or tech company or whatever, media company or whatever it was, bragging about technology bringing us together. It may bring us together and help us bridge the distance, but it's kept us all from shaking each other's hands and getting to know those closest to us. It's atomized us. It's atomized us. And in the future they're going to do all they can to promote us going into these smart cities, You know, they vilify rural living. They claim that we are hicks, uneducated. If you go to a farmer's market, you could be a far-right activist, you know. They try to vilify this traditional way of life. But the biggest thing you can do is just refuse. A refusal is one of the most powerful things a person can do, I've come to discover. Just refuse to comply. Anyways, this video's been long enough. Thank you all for watching. Bye-bye.